Well, the news we pretty much already knew is official now. There's not going to be a huge raise in the salary cap, which means the Wild will have to be very thrifty with the money they have. We'll talk about that as well as potential options for the assistant coach vacancy and more on today's episode of Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. If this is your first time tuning in to Locked on Wild, we welcome you into the show and hope that you stick around through the offseason and into next year as well. If you're one of the everydayers that tunes in each and every day of the week, glad to have you back. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we discuss potential options for the Wild's assistant coach vacancy, as well as looking at the news that the salary cap is going to raise slightly, as well as some of the other things that Gary Bettman said during his State of the League address before the Stanley Cup final. And we'll talk about some potential options for free agents if the Wilds are able to free up a little additional cap space. My name is Seth Topol, your daily Minnesota Wild insider. It is a Monday, which means, of course, we're joined by Alex Micheletti. And Alex, we had the Cup final begin. We'll talk about that a little bit later as we talk about some of Gary Bettman's comments to assess the state of the league. But the big news last week, Brett McLean introduced as the head coach of the Iowa Wild, which means that there will be a vacancy on Dean Evason's staff. First off, what did you think of McLean as the new Iowa Wild head coach? Do you like the fit?
Yeah, this guy, he always wanted to be a head coach, at some point. And so, it was just a natural progression for him, I think. So, I think it's a perfect fit. And, it's a guy that wants to work with prospects. And so the Wild have a ton of prospects that are on their way. And so, if things go well for him, it could lead to NHL head coaching gigs. So it seems like the natural fit, and it's kind of a way for the Wild to, to show, because they were highly criticized in this year's playoffs. And so, it's not a firing, but it just allows them to get a new voice and to help Dean. And so, yeah, it just works out, best for both parties for sure.
It's one of those, I think the term would be a structural reorganization that prevents the need to have to let anybody go.
Right.
Other than Tim Army, whose contract, he wasn't even necessarily let go. His contract was just allowed to expire.
Right.
So,
and, yeah, I just, I don't think it, especially with Marco Rossi's development, I just don't think they were very happy with the direction things were going with Tim's staff. And so, just, best for him to move on and get, Brett down there and to help out.
Yeah, for sure. And it leads to an opening on the NHL staff. And I wanted to kind of pick your brain a little bit because I know one guy that has been mentioned is Doug Waits. And I don't know a ton about him, but from what you have mentioned, I've seen it from others as well, would be a good fit. And if you're looking at the Dean Evason staff, so you take Brett McLean out, that's the assistant that focuses on the power play. You still have Bob Woods for the penalty kill, and you've got Darby as the vibes guy, just the other assistant in the mix. And so logical point is that they're going to need somebody to come in and run the power play. And it sounds like Doug would be a potential good fit for the Wild if they choose to go that route.
Yeah, he obviously is super close with Bill Guerin. And so, this is a guy that scored a ton of goals in the NHL, well respected throughout the league. He previously used to be a head coach with the Islanders, and so it would be somebody that Bill would trust, would be a great fit for the power play. Can turn things around with that, because we, as we know, it struggled so much in the playoffs, and you need your special teams to be elite if you want to advance and into the following rounds. And so I think it's a guy that can step in naturally. Is a veteran coach, and somebody that I think would get along with the players really well too, because he's been through the grind, knows what it takes, and so it just makes the most sense to bring him in.
Are there any other names? I know Joe Smith from The Athletic had mentioned former Panthers coach John Hynes as
Yep.
a potential option. He was replaced, ironically, by former
Predators coach.
Predators. Thank you.
Yeah.
He was replaced, ironically, by former Wild center Andrew Brunette last week as well. So Hynes would be an option. Any other names that that you think the Wild should take a look at to fill that spot?
That's who I was going to mention. Maybe an out of the box name would be Mikko Koivu, but I think if Hynes doesn't get the Rangers job, because now he's in the running for that, the options for him are kind of dwindling, because Columbus, for whatever reason, is choosing Mike Babcock. So I don't know why they think that was a good idea, but so he's taking up Columbus, and Anaheim still needs a coach, so maybe he throws his name into that. But Hynes, has another guy that has another great relationship with Bill Guerin, and so I think Bill would love to have him come here too. So
It is interesting too, and not to go on a super tangent, but some aggressive moves made by Barry Trotz with the Predators to bring Brunette in as head coach. He also had some comments about taking some aggressive swings in the draft, because, hey, let's find those top 6 guys. You can find third line, fourth line guys anywhere, as we'll talk about in a little bit. But an interesting start to the Barry Trotz tenure as president of the Nashville Predators. Just starting to make that thing look a little bit more like what you'd expect a Barry Trotz team would look like.
Yeah, and of course, there has to be a Wild connection with Andrew Brunette taking that role, and the golf cart incident did not affect his hiring. He's a very offensive minded coach, and so works out perfect for them with Roman Josi leading the way there in Nashville, and so he's going to bring an exciting brand of hockey, and Andrew can lean on a guy like Barry Trotz there, who's been a head coach, and so when it comes to game strategies, that's a good person to go to, because he's been through it, and is a heck of a coach, and and now will be a heck of a executive for sure.
Yeah, I was not super thrilled to see that that pairing came together in the Central Division. Like, stay out east.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, right. Yeah, just
stay out east or go out west.
More firepower to this division.
Yeah, which is exactly what we didn't need. But it is interesting, because you've got that going on for the Minnesota Wild. That'll be ongoing, is who they put in that spot on the staff. We're continuing to wait for word about some contract extensions that are going to be, as we've talked about, as the everydayers know, a huge part of what is going on this offseason. But I think what we heard from Gary Bettman before the Stanley Cup Finals started is probably the domino that we were waiting for to get all of that going. And that was official word about the salary cap for next season. So we'll talk about that as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild, as well as some of the other comments that Bettman made during his State of the League address. That's all coming up after this here on Locked On Wild. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day of the week. For the everydayers, we've got more player evals coming up for you the rest of the week. Tomorrow, Marcus Foligno. That'll be a juicy one for your Tuesday, to say the least. We've also got an interesting what if scenarios episode coming later this week as well. So we're continuing to just put some nice spins on the content here as we move throughout the off season. Continuing our chat with Alex Micheletti. Alex, Gary Bettman had his State of the League address before the Cup final started, and well, the nugget that I think everybody heard and wondered was Bill Daly saying that the league has never been safer in the entire history of the NHL. And I think I get what he was trying to say, but then giving a ringing endorsement of what the Department of Player Safety has done over the last couple of years, it led to just a really weird feel for Bettman's presser before the Cup final started.
Yeah, when I mean, they still the person running the department is Parros. He was an enforcer. He was a dirty player when he played, and so it just makes no sense why he is leading the department. And you're still seeing reckless hits throughout the playoffs, and so like you said, we understand what he's trying to say, but you're still seeing things go haywire in the playoffs. That hit by Jamie Benn on Mark Stone, for sure, that could have been so much worse. It was an intent to injure hit, and so I don't think it's really saying that the game is getting safer. It seems to get more dangerous.
Yeah, and I think the sentiment is, with the technology we have available, the ability to, they're getting to where they have a neurosurgeon expert on site at games, to where if anybody's showing signs of concussion, they pull them off the ice. So in that instance, yes, but the enforcement part of it is, quite honestly, just garbage. Like the suspensions or lack thereof, and then having things happen like you mentioned with Jamie Benn and Mark Stone, to where I didn't even feel like there was going to be a suspension until Ben talked to the media and was like, "Oh yeah, no, that I fell, and just happened that my stick ended up landing directly like in the middle of his face. That was not my intent." I feel like at that point then Parros
something had to be done.
Like, okay, now that you open your mouth, we have to.
But it's also it's like it's a choose your own adventure, and when it comes to how many games, and it just seems so random. No precedent at all, and just it's all over. It causes chaos and more unnecessary drama than necessary.
Maximum allowable fine of $5,000, which is like it's a $5
slap
bill
on the wrist for some of these guys that are making millions and millions of dollars.
It's a $5 bill. So that was bizarre, but we did get clarity on the fact that the salary cap will not jump by more than $1 million this season. And so now that you know that, do you think we'll start to see some of these dominoes for the Wild start to fall with extensions, things along that line? Or are we waiting until the Cup final is done before some of this business gets taken care of?
Well, now it sounds like Brandon Duhaime is going to be taken care of before Gustafson, which we thought Gus would, be the first guy, but it seems like those negotiations are taking longer than what Guerin wants. So he's going to move on and get Duhaime done here first, and so he's an important part of this team and a guy that Bill Guerin really likes, and so I think that one will be pretty easy to get done. So that'll be nice, and then for Gus, it just seems like Gus wants that 3.5 million, or maybe try to get to 4 there. So, but that's a lot for a guy that still has a lot to prove, and so that's going to be tricky. Hopefully, it doesn't go to arbitration. That would be weird for goalie, because you never see that with goalies really, and so hopefully they can come to an understanding, or try to move some guys to create more cap space, but hopefully they can get it done here relatively soon.
It would put us all at a little bit more ease of mind to have those done before we get into the big heavy lifting portion of the of the offseason, especially on the Gustafson side, because there is still that outside chance that you get offer sheeted and then are like, oh no, we can't match this. So the sooner the better there. And I'm not surprised that Duhaime has moved to the front of the list because, well, let's be honest, there may not be another show in the Wild media landscape that touts him as much as we do. And so him moving to the front of the line is just a great business decision for Locked On Wild. And that leaves you the potential then to say, okay, now we got Duhaime taken care of. And so if we want to move somebody who plays a similar type role, now we can, in, say, Marcus Foligno's case, if that's the route that they end up trying to go, or any number of other possible ways that we both have discussed and that have not yet been discussed that are still definitely on the table.
Yeah, and as we know, there's a bunch of fringe defensemen that they can take a look at to help create space too. A guy like Alex Goligoski, who didn't get to play down the stretch. Not he was a healthy scratch, so not because of injury. And same thing with John Merrill, who had a tough end of the season there, and Kalen Addison, who was not trusted, and the Wild traded for John Klingberg because they didn't want Kalen in the lineup, and so you have 3 defensemen on the end there that could possibly be moved to get more assets, or to create space for the Wild to be able to re-sign Gus and Duhaime. And so and it'll be very interesting couple weeks here leading up to the draft.
Most definitely. We're going to finish today's episode looking at some potential free agent names with a caveat, because we all know there's not a lot of money to go around, and so we're gonna caveat the conversation so that we can actually look at some of these free agent names. We'll do that to finish today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Everydayers, tune in for more of our player evals here throughout the rest of the week. We'll get to the third line, including the incoming players via trade that helped the Wild down the stretch. We'll talk about all of those and more as we move throughout the rest of the week here on Locked On Wild. But first, as we continue today's conversation with Alex Micheletti, let's assume that there is some money freed up. There is some money opened to be able to use to look at some free agents. Brian on YouTube, one of our everydayers, one of our longtime commenters, put together a list, and I want to just go through some of these names and see if there is interest in going to these routes, or if they may be a little too pricey for what the Wild would be able to afford. We'll start with former Wild defenseman, and this is going to always be one of my big what ifs. Carson Soucy, who was with the Seattle Kraken the last couple of years. He's a big defenseman, and I'm always going to wonder what would have happened had the Kraken taken Kaapo Kähkönen as opposed to Carson Soucy. But would you be interested in a Soucy reunion if the money works? And would he be interested in coming here as opposed to testing the free agent market?
I think he would love to come back. He played at UMD. He's familiar. He's been with this organization in the past, and so he played very well when he was with the Wild. And so I think it would be a great fit to bring him back. With him, I think they would have to free up some more cap space to sign him. He's one of those guys that would want the Wild to give him more than million and a half, and so. Yeah. But it would be a perfect fit. He would help on the penalty kill, just a steady defenseman that you wouldn't have to worry about on the third pairing. It always seems with the Wild here that the third pairing is always just like, oh boy, an adventure. And so I think he would bring a steady presence. He was drafted by this team, and so clearly they liked him. It was a different GM that drafted him, but I think Bill Guerin really enjoyed having him on the team, and would like to have him back.
The Wild have been chasing a solid third pair since Carson Soucy and Ian Cole were the third pairing. That was Bill Guerin's, I think, first full season as GM for the Wild. He made the trade for Ian Cole like a week into the season for Greg Pattern, who ended up being sent to facilitate that trade, and then he got traded again. But yeah,
just some names that live in our minds. For we'll always remember guys like that.
Greg Pattern's just going to live rent free in my head for probably the rest of my life. Just every now and again, I just will remember that Greg Pattern exists and that he was part of the Minnesota Wild and then was traded. I can't even fathom that trade being essentially a 1-for-1. And the fact that then Pattern got later traded, and I will never understand how that was made to work other than purely for salary cap reasons.
Yeah, just crazy, right? A trivia guy name, for sure.
Yeah, he's definitely the answer to a trivia question. Let's go through some others. Alex Turcotte of the Los Angeles Kings. As a potential name as well. He was making just under $1 million, but with how well the Kings played, he may be in line for a hefty raise if he doesn't stay in Los Angeles.
Yeah, that's a guy I can never figure out. He was on that national U.S. development team with Zegras and all those guys, and I'm sure the Kings are kicking themselves for not drafting Zegras over Turcotte. Turcotte has had some injuries. He's a guy that probably should have stayed another year at Wisconsin, but came out early, and for injuries and just not living up to being a first round draft pick. It hasn't really worked out with the Kings. Like you talked about too, the Kings have a ton of prospects, and so maybe a fresh start would work out for him. I think you could get him cheaper just because the production hasn't been there, and so it's a guy you could take a flyer on, but you're also dealing with Marco Rossi, not so far not living up to expectations. So I don't know if you want to take on another guy like that, but maybe Brett McLean could help him out and get him to join the Wild. But it's also a guy. It's the same thing with Rossi. Turcotte, I don't think is a fourth line guy. That's right. A kid that when you're drafted in the top 10 that you would hope could be a top 6 guy. And so if he doesn't fit into the top 6, do you want him to? Does he want to come to a team and be on the fourth line? I don't think so. That's a tough one. He has all the potential in the world, but he still hasn't shown it yet.
Give me a third line pairing of Carson Soucy and Braden Shen. Shen is another name on this list, and
Luke Shen.
Luke Shen, thank you.
Yeah, I don't think Wild fans would want Braden on the team because he had his battle. He's had his battles with the Wild throughout the years, and especially this past season, that St. Louis game, as we've talked about in previous episodes, where he went unhinged.
I was out in 90-degree heat for 9 hours on Saturday, so I'm just gonna chalk it up to my brain having fried. But big physical defenseman, which is
Yes.
something that the Wild do need. And so if that would be a potential option, relatively cheap, I think his salary cap number, I think it was at 850,000. So
I would take that in a heartbeat. If it
yeah,
has to go up a little bit, you do it, because that's the type of guy that you want in the playoffs. A rugged defenseman. The Wild are always heavily criticized for being undersized on the back end, and we've seen it. Time and time again, it's led to early exits because just we know the defensemen are undersized here, and so that's a guy that's been in big time Stanley Cup playoff games, and is responsible, can get the puck out of his own end without any issues, and a good locker room guy, and so it would be a perfect fit for this team.
yeah. Would you rather have John Merrill at 2.25
Heck no.
or Luke Shen at 1 point? Any number under what Merrill is making, or even at what Merrill is making?
I feel like it continues, like we see a pattern, like Merrill is this off season's Dmitry Kulikov, so hopefully hopefully Bill can find a team like Arizona or Anaheim, teams that have cap space that they're willing to just let teams dump players off with bad contracts. So hopefully that can happen with Merrill, or same thing with Goligoski. Maybe Goligoski wants to go back to the desert, and that's a team that always has cap space, and a team that takes on dead contracts. So yeah, it's hopefully they can figure that out.
The final name on here, and it is a list that we'll go through as we get closer to free agency in full, but just scanning through some of these names, the one that I wanted to finish with, Patrice Bergeron.
Oh man,
Brian does say here,
yes,
to be fair, he says pipe dream, and it is, but that would be so fun to even if there was a remote chance of it happening, would just be outrageously fun.
Oh, 100%. I mean, he's the best two-way center in the past, decade and a half. I love Patrice Bergeron. He's so much fun to watch. He's not flashy, but he does everything right. The ultimate leader. Yeah, I don't think he's going to play again. Just the herniated disc in his back does not sound like that he wants to come back from something like that. And he has a family, probably does not want to move them to a place like Minnesota. That would be fun. Another name that you mentioned to me off air, but was I think on Brian's list, was Anthony from the Blackhawks. I love him. He has so much skill and speed. That's a guy that if the Wild would be able to open up a little bit more cap space, he'd be my number one guy in a heartbeat. I just think he's the perfect fit for this Wild team. Him and Max Domi took cheap contracts to play for Chicago, hoping that both would get moved at the deadline, and for whatever reason it didn't happen for Anthony Ciu. So that's a guy that has caused trouble for the Wild in the past, and a guy that would bring much needed speed element to this team, and a guy that can play on any line. We saw him with Chicago move up and down, and a guy that can play on the power play too. So that would help out a second unit that had guys on there that should have never been on the power play. Foligno is not a power play guy, and so yeah, it was a disaster, and it led to the number one unit, almost having to play, full 2 minutes, and I think guys just got gassed a lot.
A couple of other names. Zach has really championed this one. He texted me this during game one. Ivan Barbashev would be on his list. I can't disagree there, because he's just a really solid player that I think if you could find a way to fit him in would be a great help to this team, and one that I'll throw on the list just because of the beard, Radko Gudas. Like, find a way to make that happen. Keep that beard. I made the comment, I think I tweeted out when they showed the picture of him in the suit that looked a little more of kind of a colonial suit. I said Ulysses S. Gudis. If you haven't seen it, look for the picture on Twitter of the beard that is literally like this long and just like full curl. He looks like a general in the 1800s.
Yeah,
So get him too.
Yeah, I think he'd be a Walmart version of Luke Shen. It's probably a guy you can get cheaper than Shen. But he's a guy that again, another type of defenseman that has played in a lot of playoff games, is rugged, throws the body, can can help on the penalty kill, and a guy that brings the intimidation factor. So, it would be a perfect fit for sure. Barbashev, man, he's like the Kachucks. Every team, would want a guy like Barbashev on there. I think he's going to get paid big time. So that's a pipe dream. You would have to move probably one of these no move deal guys, or ask them to move that to help create space, because I think he's going to get paid a ton of money just with the way he's playing in the playoffs.
And you'd have to move a center too.
Right.
You'd have to get rid of a center to free that up. So, like I said, we'll talk about these names in more detail, but it did provide an intriguing kind of initial look into free agency 101, as it was. So that is going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Wilds. Now that you are finished with today's episode, again, we thank you for tuning in. If this is your first time tuning into Locked On Wild, make sure that you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms, which includes Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, and now Sirius XM. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen so that you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the rest of the offseason and beyond. If you're an everydayer that tunes in every day of the week, we'll see you tomorrow with a new episode of Locked On Wild. You can find new episodes each and every day of the week as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.